Tonight, we're traveling back in time, but not to the era of swipes, unread DMs, or ghosted text messages. No, tonight we dive into a period when romance was not just complicated. It was a carefully choreographed dance of propriety, reputation, and relentless rules. Welcome to the year 1872, the peak of the Edwardian courtship customs. If you think modern dating is stressful, just wait until you hear how a simple compliment could make or break a young woman's entire future, where a glance was heavy with consequence, and a misplaced gift could destroy a family's standing overnight. Before we get swept into this world of lace gloves, elaborate etiquette, and unspoken desires, I'd love it if you could hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps keep the channel growing and lets me bring you more fascinating deep dives like this. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It always amazes me to see people all over the world tuning in. All right, get comfortable, sink into your couch, your bed, or wherever you are right now, and let your imagination carry you back into the misty streets of 19th century London. Because the tale we're about to unfold might just leave you grateful for dating apps after all. The year is 1872. The city awakens under a heavy, low sky that promises rain before evening. The ever-present clatter of carriage wheels rattles across the damp cobblestones, and the air carries the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts, wet stone, and the smoky tang of burning coal from countless chimneys. London breathes, restless, bustling, teeming with stories at every corner. Inside a modest but respectable townhouse nestled near the district of Bloomsbury, 23-year-old Eleanor Winthrop blinks her eyes open as the early morning light creeps through the thick drapery. The fog outside muffles the sounds of street vendors hawking their goods, milk, newspapers, fresh bread. But none of that occupies Eleanor's mind at this particular hour. Today, everything changes. Eleanor belongs to a family of comfortable means. Her father, Mr. Alfred Winthrop, has built a reputable business as a bookbinder, a trade that demands precision, care, and an appreciation for beauty. While not extravagantly wealthy, the Winthrops have enough standing to move through society's middle tiers with dignity. Their home boasts several well-kept rooms, 2 housemaids, and a cook, small luxuries that signal their place in the delicate social ladder of Edwardian London. But being a woman of 23 in 1872 carries a weight that Eleanor feels pressed down upon her chest the moment she rises from bed. Each day not married is a step closer to spinsterhood, a quiet but certain fate that lurks in the periphery of polite conversation. Unlike today's world where independence may be celebrated, Eleanor's future is inextricably linked to marriage, not just for companionship but for security, respectability, and survival. The faint creak of the bedroom door announces the arrival of Margaret, the family's senior housemaid, who has served the Winthrops since Eleanor was a child. Margaret enters with quiet efficiency, balancing a heavy coal scuttle against her hip, her face already smudged with soot from tending to the downstairs fireplaces. Eleanor watches as Margaret kneels before the hearth and expertly arranges the kindling. Sparks leap eagerly as the first flames catch, their orange glow pushing back the morning chill. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," Margaret says softly, brushing her hands on her apron. "Your mother asks that you dress in your green satin this morning. The Worthingtons are calling this afternoon." Eleanor's stomach tenses, though her face remains composed. The Worthingtons. She knows what this means. Mr. and Mrs. Worthington are bringing their son, Edward, recently returned from his travels as an assistant to a trading consortium operating routes between London and Morocco. This is not a casual visit. It is an audition. The expectations of courtship loom heavily in this world. Eleanor's mother, Mrs. Abigail Winthrop, has spent weeks orchestrating this encounter with meticulous precision, penning letters back and forth with Mrs. Worthington to arrange every detail. There will be tea. There will be polite conversation, and there will be judgment, silent, careful judgment, on both sides. Margaret moves about the room with quiet competence, laying out Eleanor's undergarments with practiced hands. Eleanor rises from bed, the chill of the oak floor biting at her bare feet, and allows Margaret to begin the familiar ritual of dressing. Privacy, as Eleanor knows, is a luxury for men. For women, servants are constant companions from childhood until marriage, observing every stage of undress without ceremony. The chemise is slipped over her head first, light, soft, and cool against her skin. Next comes the corset, the unforgiving cage of whalebone and tightly stitched cotton that will squeeze Eleanor's waist into the coveted hourglass silhouette. As Margaret pulls the laces, Eleanor grips the edge of her dressing table, breathing in short, shallow bursts as the pressure tightens. "Not too tight, Margaret," she whispers. "No tighter than fashion permits, miss," Margaret replies, her tone both sympathetic and dutiful. Once the corset is secured, Margaret begins layering Eleanor's ensemble, the bustle pad that adds volume to the back of her skirt, multiple petticoats to achieve the desired fullness, and finally, the emerald satin gown embroidered with delicate silver threading. The dress, saved for special occasions, glimmers faintly in the morning light. The finishing touches follow: soft leather slippers with tiny pearl buttons, white gloves, and a narrow silver chain bearing a small locket, a family heirloom containing a miniature portrait of Eleanor's late grandmother. Makeup is absent. The pale complexion valued by society is achieved not by powder but by remaining indoors, away from the sun that marks laborers and servants. Margaret then tends to Eleanor's hair, parting it cleanly down the center and coiling it into an intricate chignon secured with ornate hairpins. Loose tendrils frame her face in carefully calculated elegance. As Margaret works, Eleanor allows her thoughts to wander toward the afternoon's encounter. She has heard whispers about Edward Worthington, that he is well-mannered, financially stable, and crucially, unmarried at 28. Her mother appears in the doorway as the preparations near completion, her expression both approving and expectant. Mrs. Winthrop, at 48, wears her years gracefully, her figure still trim beneath the dark plum silk she has chosen for the occasion. The fine lines around her mouth and eyes speak of both worry and determination. Years spent navigating the precarious tightrope of social ambition. "You look radiant, my dear," she says softly, stepping into the room. "Now we must go over a few points before their arrival." Eleanor turns to face her mother, knowing the lecture to come is as rehearsed as the act they are both about to perform. These rules are not suggestions. They are the framework upon which a respectable courtship must be built. Firstly, her mother begins, seating herself on the edge of the upholstered chair. "Under no circumstance are you to accept any tokens or gifts today, no matter how harmless they may appear. Flowers are permissible if presented by Mrs. Worthington, but nothing more substantial. An early exchange of gifts suggests impropriety." Eleanor nods, absorbing the reminder. Secondly, physical contact is strictly limited. No handshakes unless your father formally introduces you. If Mr. Worthington offers his arm while promenading, you may accept, but only lightly, and always under my watchful eye. Again, Eleanor nods, though her stomach coils with nerves. Lastly, Mrs. Winthrop continues, leaning forward. "Allow him to lead the conversation, but do not remain silent. A man of ambition appreciates a woman with grace and intellect, provided she does not challenge him openly. Express opinions delicately. Disagreement, if necessary, should be wrapped in curiosity, not defiance." She reaches out to smooth a stray curl near Eleanor's temple. "Remember, my dear, you are being assessed as much for your charm as for your obedience." The weight of these expectations presses heavily on Eleanor's shoulders, but she offers her mother a small smile, knowing that resistance is neither useful nor wise. The rest of the morning passes in a flurry of minor distractions: arranging fresh flowers for the drawing room, supervising cook as she prepares dainty lemon cakes and cucumber sandwiches, and practicing a short sonata on the pianoforte, one of the many accomplishments a proper young woman must possess. Every detail must convey refinement without ostentation. As the grandfather clock in the foyer strikes 2:30, Eleanor positions herself on the settee by the bay window, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. Her mother sits nearby with her embroidery, while Mr. Winthrop paces lightly, glancing at his pocket watch. The drawing room gleams, polished mahogany surfaces, delicate lace curtains, and the faint scent of lavender oil filling the air. Outside, the sky has darkened to a pewter shade as the clouds gather, and Eleanor feels her pulse quicken. The first knock at the door is sharp, precise, and unmistakable. The moment has arrived. The door creaked open with the slow grace of formality, revealing the tall figure of Mr. Charles Worthington, Edward's father, his silver hair neatly parted and his dark wool suit pressed to perfection, bearing the slightest sheen beneath the dim afternoon light. His gloved hands gripped a fine walking stick with a silver wolf's head handle, which tapped gently against the polished floor as he stepped forward. Behind him followed Mrs. Henrietta Worthington, her gown a deep burgundy trimmed with intricate black lace, her bosom adorned with a modest brooch that shimmered faintly as she moved. And then came Edward himself, a man of firm posture standing a head taller than his mother, his dark chestnut hair swept carefully back from his brow, his complexion tanned lightly from years beneath foreign suns. His brown eyes scanned the room as he entered, briefly meeting Eleanor's gaze before respectfully lowering his eyes in accordance with custom. "Mr. and Mrs. Worthington," Mr. Winthrop announced with smooth authority, stepping forward. "Allow me to present my wife, Mrs. Winthrop, and our daughter, Miss Eleanor Winthrop." As rehearsed, Eleanor rose from the settee in one fluid motion, lowering herself into a modest curtsy, careful to maintain the delicate balance between humility and dignity. The weight of her skirts settled gracefully around her as she dipped her head. "Mr. Worthington, Mrs. Worthington, Mr. Edward Worthington." She spoke softly, her voice carrying the precise mixture of politeness and calm that her mother had drilled into her for years. The elder Worthingtons exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Winthrop as Edward stepped forward and offered a slight, practiced bow. "Miss Winthrop," he greeted her, his voice smooth yet resonant, carrying the faintest trace of an accent, perhaps a subtle hint of North African French influence acquired during his overseas employment. "A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance." "The pleasure is mine, sir," Eleanor replied, allowing her eyes to meet his for but a heartbeat before lowering them once again. As the introductions concluded, the group positioned themselves like performers taking their places upon a stage set for an elaborate drama. Mr. Worthington took a stately seat near Mr. Winthrop, both men already murmuring quietly about trade routes and shipping tariffs, as though warming up for deeper negotiations that would surely follow. Mrs. Worthington sat beside Mrs. Winthrop, their embroidery frames resting on their laps to offer the appearance of casual engagement, while every glance remained sharply observant. Edward settled into the high-backed chair opposite Eleanor, close enough for conversation but carefully distant to preserve propriety. A moment of silence hovered as everyone adjusted, the measured pause as much a part of the ritual as the introductions themselves. Eleanor folded her gloved hands gently atop her lap, the sheen of the silk gloves catching the low light while her heartbeat fluttered beneath her corset's restrictive embrace. "It seems we've been granted a rare dry afternoon," Edward began, his voice smooth, his words deliberate, carrying an effortless charm that betrayed practiced social experience. "I feared the weather might turn, but fortune appears to favor our meeting." "Indeed," Eleanor responded with a faint smile, her voice as polished as her appearance. "London's weather is famously fickle, but we can be grateful for such kindness today." The conversation unfolded like a carefully choreographed waltz, each partner gliding along prescribed patterns of small talk and respectable topics. Edward spoke of his time in Morocco, recounting with practiced ease the vibrant bazaars of Marrakesh, the ornate architecture of Casablanca, and the challenges of navigating foreign customs in a world so unlike London's rigid structures. He spoke of vibrant markets heavy with spices and textiles, of camels and winding desert caravans that painted surreal portraits beneath endless azure skies. Eleanor listened attentively, interjecting gently with questions that allowed Edward to elaborate further, her tone always curious but never confrontational. "The fabrics from that region are said to be quite remarkable," she commented softly. "Did you find their trade practices very different from ours?" "In some ways, quite," Edward admitted, his lips curling into a small smile. "There is a fluidity in their transactions, an openness to negotiation that might unsettle many English merchants. but one adapts quickly when necessity demands. His brown eyes flickered with a quiet humor as he continued. Though I must say, I gained quite an appreciation for our own bureaucratic efficiency after several months. That speaks well of your adaptability, Mr. Worthington, Eleanor replied, carefully offering him an indirect compliment, one that demonstrated both her understanding and her discretion. Margaret appeared at the door shortly after, balancing a polished silver tray as cook's freshly prepared lemon cakes and meticulously cut cucumber sandwiches were presented alongside delicate bone china teacups. She moved about the room silently, placing refreshments before each guest with practiced grace. Edward acknowledged her with a brief nod and quiet, "Thank you," an observation Eleanor silently filed away. A man's treatment of servants often revealed character in ways polished conversation could not. As Margaret poured the tea, Eleanor could feel her mother's eyes subtly watching every exchange. The art of courtship was as much about reading unspoken cues as it was about the conversation itself. Eleanor observed Edward's steady hands as he lifted his cup, his composed demeanor never faltering. Yet, there was a brief flicker of tension when a porcelain cup on Mrs. Worthington's saucer clinked louder than intended, a sound sharp enough to momentarily stiffen Edward's posture. The tightness in his jaw vanished as quickly as it appeared, but Eleanor noticed. She noticed everything. The room filled with the quiet symphony of spoons tapping gently against china as the conversation continued. Edward spoke of his role within the trading consortium, a position overseeing the management of European goods bound for North African markets. It was a role that required diplomacy, calculation, and fluency in multiple languages. Not the brute mercantile aggression of dockside traders, but rather the sophisticated negotiation of contracts and relationships with foreign partners, skills highly prized among the ambitious merchant class. My father often says that successful commerce requires patience above all, Edward remarked with a smile directed toward Mr. Winthrop. The ability to navigate shifting currents without panicking at the first storm. Sound advice, Mr. Winthrop agreed, nodding approvingly as he stirred his tea. Though few young men develop such patience so early, Eleanor allowed herself another faint smile, noting the deliberate way her father's compliments were offered, carefully measured to reveal interest without signaling desperation. As the conversation flowed gently from trade to literature, Eleanor found subtle ways to display her education without overstepping. She spoke briefly of the poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, of the moral dilemmas explored in George Eliot's most recent works, and of her quiet fascination with botanical studies, a pursuit that conveniently signaled refinement without threatening masculine sensibilities. Edward's interest appeared genuine, his responses thoughtful yet always respectful. He listened when Eleanor spoke, asked clarifying questions, and seemed genuinely amused when she shared a light anecdote about her younger brother's failed attempt to cultivate orchids in their small conservatory. Yet beneath it all, Eleanor continued to watch his micro-expressions, the smallest flickers of emotion that briefly surfaced before his social armor reasserted itself. As the final crumbs of cake disappeared and the second round of tea was poured, Mr. Winthrop and Mr. Worthington shifted their discussion to matters of shipping contracts and import taxes, an intentional cue signaling the gradual wind-down of the social visit. The carefully measured hour of polite engagement had nearly reached its conclusion. Edward straightened slightly, then spoke with a touch more formality. "Mr. Winthrop, if I may, I would be most honored to request the opportunity to call upon Miss Winthrop again, should it be agreeable to both families." The moment hung suspended like the pause between movements of a symphony. Mr. Winthrop glanced briefly toward his wife, who offered him a nearly imperceptible nod of approval, before turning back to Edward with a small, measured smile. "We would be pleased to receive you again, Mr. Worthington," he replied, his tone conveying both authority and warm formality. Edward inclined his head with visible satisfaction. "Then perhaps this Sunday afternoon, if that would be suitable." "Sunday would be most agreeable," Mrs. Winthrop interjected smoothly. As Edward and his parents prepared to take their leave, Eleanor stood once more, executing her part in the courtship ballet with poise, her gloved hand smoothing her gown as she offered a final curtsy. The Worthingtons exited the drawing room with their hosts accompanying them to the front hall. their voices softened by the thick carpeting as goodbyes were exchanged. When the door finally closed behind them, Mrs. Winthrop exhaled softly, clasping her hands before her. "Well," she said, her voice warm yet measured, "he is most promising. Polite, articulate, and appropriately ambitious. And I must say, Eleanor, you carried yourself splendidly." Eleanor offered a faint smile but said nothing, her mind still processing the countless subtleties of the encounter. Edward Worthington had performed well. Very well. And yet, the tiniest of cracks had revealed themselves if one knew where to look. The days between Thursday's initial visit and the anticipated Sunday afternoon passed with a peculiar blend of restlessness and deliberate preparation. The Winthrop household hummed with subtle energy, each family member performing their roles in the elaborate theater of Victorian courtship. Though the encounter with Edward had gone precisely as propriety demanded, a lingering tension fluttered beneath the carefully arranged calm. It was not anxiety born of fear or dread, but of the immense weight resting invisibly upon Eleanor's narrow shoulders. She knew full well that such introductions, once begun, carried momentum that was difficult to arrest. Courtship in this era, after all, was not a playful dalliance but a sequence of deliberate maneuvers toward an inevitable conclusion. And every word, every gesture, every glance would be scrutinized not only by her family but by the broader community of whispering tongues and judgmental eyes that formed London's merciless social web. On Friday morning, Eleanor sought a brief escape into the household's modest conservatory, where her mother maintained an assortment of potted ferns, orchids, and other delicate flora that thrived within the steamy glass enclosure. The humidity clung to her skin as she moved among the leafy green, trailing her gloved fingertips gently across smooth leaves and damp petals. The sweet aroma of blooming lilies offered a small sanctuary from the swirling thoughts preoccupying her mind. Margaret, ever attentive, stood just outside the door, a respectful distance away yet close enough to respond if summoned. Eleanor appreciated the unspoken balance they maintained, companionship without intrusion. As she admired the pale blossoms of a particularly vibrant begonia, Eleanor allowed her mind to revisit Edward Worthington's every word and expression. There was no denying that he possessed every credential a family like hers would hope for in a prospective match: financial security, respectable parentage, international experience, and, most importantly, manners unmarred by obvious defects. And yet, that tiny moment, the sharp tension that overtook him when the teacup had clattered, stirred an unrelenting curiosity within her. It was a crack in the polished facade, an echo of something deeper that propriety would not allow her to question openly. Still, Eleanor's instincts, sharpened by years of quiet observation, could not let it go. She had been trained to see such things, even if she dared not speak them aloud. Later that afternoon, while assisting her mother with the day's correspondence, Eleanor found herself penning thank-you notes to several neighbors who had sent invitations for upcoming garden parties and luncheons. These carefully worded missives carried their own coded messages, maintaining the family's presence within the intricate web of social expectations. Each phrase was crafted to subtly reaffirm the Winthrops' respectable standing, while signaling appropriate levels of enthusiasm without seeming overeager. Eleanor's handwriting was immaculate, every curve of her script conveying an air of practiced refinement. Her mother reviewed each note before sealing the envelopes with wax, nodding her approval. "You are composing yourself admirably, my dear," Mrs. Winthrop remarked with a faint smile as she pressed the final seal. "These early stages are always delicate, but your comportment thus far has been flawless." Eleanor returned her mother's compliment with a demure nod, though her mind remained elsewhere. The scripts she followed now had been rehearsed since childhood. Yet, beyond the surface of rehearsed dialogues and embroidered linens, Eleanor sensed the profound consequences lurking beneath each interaction. A favorable marriage would secure not only her own future, but also safeguard the family's economic stability. The Winthrops' bookbinding business had flourished for years, but competition from industrial presses threatened the long-term certainty of their trade. Edward's financial resources and commercial connections represented more than personal companionship. They represented survival. Saturday morning dawned beneath a sky of muted silver, the thick clouds pressing low over the rooftops like heavy velvet drapery. A fine mist hung in the air, coating the streets with moisture that clung to carriage wheels and horse hooves alike. The marketplace was unusually lively despite the weather, as merchants hawked fresh produce, fabrics, and various imported curiosities along the crowded lanes. Eleanor ventured briefly into town alongside her mother, the pair accompanied by Margaret, who carried their purchases and ensured their safety amid the bustle. As they perused bolts of fabric and inspected fresh deliveries of French lace, Eleanor could not help but overhear fragments of conversation from nearby shoppers. Names were whispered, reputations dissected, fortunes speculated upon. In a world where appearances mattered above all else, the collective voice of London society acted as both judge and executioner. One misstep could doom a young woman's prospects before they ever fully began. At the draper's shop, Mrs. Winthrop selected several yards of soft lavender silk while engaging in light conversation with Mrs. Hargrave, an acquaintance known for her sharp observations and well-placed connections. The exchange was filled with pleasantries, but Eleanor noted the subtle probes woven into Mrs. Hargrave's questions. Was Edward Worthington truly as eligible as he appeared? Had the Winthrops secured his interest firmly? Were there other families vying for his attention? Each inquiry was disguised beneath layers of polite concern, but Eleanor recognized the game being played. Her mother navigated the conversation masterfully, offering enough to satisfy curiosity while revealing nothing that might expose vulnerability. As the women exited the shop, Eleanor caught a glimpse of herself in the large window display, a reflection of poise and propriety clad in a pale gray walking gown, her posture straight, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. But behind the composed exterior, her thoughts churned restlessly. She knew that in the eyes of many she was little more than a piece upon a grand chessboard, a pawn being positioned for advantageous marriage. And yet, Eleanor quietly vowed that she would retain what independence of mind she could, even within the tight confines of society's strict rules. The remainder of the day passed swiftly in preparation for Sunday's return visit. The drawing room was aired and polished once more, new arrangements of spring hyacinths placed upon the mantels, and the family silver gleamed beneath the lamplight. Cook busied herself with baking a fresh batch of honey cakes, while Margaret ironed fine linen tablecloths to ensure every detail reflected the Winthrops' impeccable standards. The entire house moved like clockwork, each servant performing their role without instruction, so ingrained were the customs of such occasions. That evening, as twilight descended and the first lamps flickered to life along the damp city streets, Eleanor sat by her bedroom window, staring into the gathering dusk. The gaslights outside cast soft golden halos in the mist, while distant carriage wheels sent up faint splashes from puddles reflecting the amber glow. Her mind once again returned to Edward Worthington's face. The measured charm, the courteous gestures, the brief flicker of unease. She could not predict where this path would lead, but she knew that tomorrow's visit might reveal more. As Margaret entered with the final preparations for bed, Eleanor offered her a tired smile. The maid spoke softly, sensing her mistress's preoccupation. "Tomorrow will go well, miss. You've handled yourself better than any lady I've served. There's no cause for worry." "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor replied gently. "Your confidence is most welcome." After the lamps were extinguished and the house fell into stillness, Eleanor lay beneath the weight of her quilts, listening to the steady ticking of the small clock on her bedside table. Each beat marked 1 second closer to the moment that could decide her future. And with that, she finally allowed sleep to carry her into uneasy dreams where whispers and distant teacups echoed faintly in the darkness. The morning of Edward's second visit arrived dressed in an unexpected warmth, as though spring itself had conspired to lend its favor to the occasion. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of the Winthrop residence, casting intricate patterns upon the polished mahogany floors. The air outside smelled faintly of lilac and fresh earth, and for a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that perhaps the day's events might unfold with the same grace and lightness offered by the season. She rose early, unable to remain still beneath her heavy quilts, and found Margaret already preparing the morning fire, her face flushed from the heat of carrying coal from the cellar. Margaret greeted her with her usual quiet smile, sensing her mistress's restless anticipation without comment, and set about arranging Eleanor's garments for the day. Today, the chosen dress was of pale rose silk embroidered with tiny cream blossoms along the hem and cuffs, a gown carefully selected to present an image both refined and subtly inviting. Its gentle color flattered Eleanor's complexion and emphasized her youth, while the embroidery reflected attention to detail that spoke to her mother's precise planning. The corset, as always, followed, and though Margaret laced it with practiced care, Eleanor still felt the familiar compression tighten around her ribs. Breathing deeply was impossible. Her breaths became shallow, measured, and controlled, an exercise she had long mastered. The bustle and petticoats followed, layer upon layer until she stood encased once more in the heavy armor of femininity that society required of her. Margaret brushed Eleanor's hair into a sleek, low chignon, allowing 2 delicate curls to frame her face while securing the rest with pearl-tipped pins. A thin chain of silver carrying a tiny opal pendant, her grandmother's, rested just above the modest neckline of her bodice. The overall effect was not ostentatious but undeniably polished. Eleanor examined herself briefly in the looking glass before offering Margaret a soft nod of approval. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice calm though her heart quickened with each passing moment. Downstairs, the household bustled in controlled efficiency. Cook prepared the midday tea, her apron dusted lightly with flour from the morning's honey cakes, while Margaret and the junior housemaid polished the silver service until each spoon and teapot gleamed beneath the gaslit sconces. Fresh bouquets of garden peonies and hydrangeas were positioned in the drawing room, their soft fragrance mingling with the faint scent of beeswax and lemon oil from the freshly scrubbed wood surfaces. Every detail was curated, every corner prepared for the silent judgments that would unfold within these walls. Mrs. Winthrop, dressed in a deep emerald gown with lace trim, surveyed the preparations with practiced eyes, adjusting the placement of a lace doily here, instructing Margaret to refold a linen napkin there. She was the conductor of this intricate social symphony, each servant and family member and instrument executing their part under her watchful direction. When Eleanor descended the staircase, her mother paused to take her in fully, nodding with satisfaction. "Perfect, my dear," she said softly, her voice betraying just the slightest tremor of nerves hidden beneath its polished cadence. "You look precisely as you should. Graceful, modest, and ready." Eleanor offered a faint smile, knowing her mother's words were both reassurance and command. She understood the stakes without being reminded. Mr. Winthrop entered the room shortly thereafter, adjusting the cuffs of his dark morning coat as he glanced at the clock. "We are ready?" he asked, though he knew the answer. His wife nodded firmly. The stage was set. At precisely 2 o'clock, as the bells of St. Mary's Church chimed gently in the distance, a firm rap echoed against the polished oak of the front door. Margaret answered, opening it wide to reveal Edward Worthington standing beneath the afternoon sun, a modest bouquet of freshly cut daisies and lavender in his gloved hands. He wore a tailored navy coat, lighter gray trousers, and a soft cream cravat pinned with a simple pearl, a wardrobe that struck a careful balance between formality and relaxed familiarity. "Good afternoon, Miss Winthrop." Edward greeted her with a small bow as Margaret ushered him inside. "I trust the day finds you well." "Very well, Mr. Worthington," Eleanor replied with grace, lowering her gaze momentarily before lifting her eyes to meet his. "And yourself?" "Quite well, thank you," he answered, his smile warm and genuine. He extended the bouquet toward her. "A small token. They reminded me of the garden behind my mother's house. I thought you might enjoy them." Flowers were one of the few acceptable offerings between an unmarried man and woman, and Eleanor accepted them with a small curtsy, inhaling their soft scent. "They are lovely. Thank you." The ritual greetings completed, the party moved once more into the drawing room, where tea was already prepared and waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop took their familiar positions as silent chaperones, offering the illusion of privacy while maintaining control over the proceedings. Eleanor and Edward resumed their seated positions across from one another, separated by a respectable distance, yet close enough for quiet conversation. The initial exchanges danced once more through familiar topics: weather, local events, and the latest publications of moral essays circulating among London's educated circles. Edward spoke with ease about a recent public lecture he had attended on the future of British industry, delivered by a renowned economist whose ideas challenged conventional wisdom. Eleanor listened attentively, offering thoughtful reflections that signaled both intelligence and restraint. "I wonder," she ventured cautiously, "whether such rapid industrial progress risks unsettling certain trades that rely upon the slower craftsman's touch. My father often worries about such matters in his own business." Edward's gaze sharpened slightly, impressed by her careful insight. "Indeed, Miss Winthrop, the balance between efficiency and quality is delicate. Innovation, if unchecked, risks devouring the very traditions that define our identity. But I believe adaptability is our great national strength." Their conversation deepened as they discussed topics far beyond the expected trivialities, moving into philosophy, literature, and the complexities of imperial commerce. Edward's experiences abroad lent his stories an exotic flair, while Eleanor's measured inquiries revealed a mind well-read and quietly inquisitive. Neither pushed the conversation toward dangerous ground, yet beneath the civility, an unspoken testing unfolded, a delicate probing of intellects, values, and temperaments veiled beneath lace and etiquette. Once again, Eleanor observed Edward's demeanor with careful attention. His politeness never wavered, his humor remained gentle and appropriate, and his interest in her seemed genuine. But occasionally, only occasionally, his composure would stiffen briefly when loud sounds interrupted their exchange. When Margaret accidentally dropped a spoon against the silver tray, producing a sharp metallic clang, Edward's jaw tensed imperceptibly for a fleeting moment before he smiled and resumed his sentence. To anyone else, the reaction might have gone unnoticed. But Eleanor saw it. The hour progressed smoothly under the watchful eyes of their parents, each moment moving them closer to the precipice of formal courtship. As the conversation began to wind down, Edward straightened slightly, his voice taking on a tone of quiet formality. "Mr. Winthrop," he said, turning toward Eleanor's father, "I remain most honored by your family's hospitality. With your permission, sir, I would very much like to continue my visits if Miss Winthrop remains agreeable." "Mr." Winthrop glanced once more at his wife, who returned a subtle nod of approval. He turned back to Edward with a composed smile. "You are welcome to continue calling, Mr. Worthington." Eleanor lowered her eyes, allowing a small, genuine smile to bloom upon her lips. The first formal layer of their courtship had now been laid, and the game advanced into its next phase. The following weeks unfolded in a measured rhythm, as steady and predictable as the ticking of the grandfather clock that presided over the Winthrop household's parlor. Edward's visits became routine, each one scheduled with the same precision that characterized all respectable courtships. Sundays were reserved for afternoon calls, Wednesday evenings for brief promenades under the careful supervision of Eleanor's mother, and on occasion, the Worthingtons would extend invitations to join them at the Botanical Gardens or attend a concert at the Philharmonic Hall. The early, delicate dance of observation had given way to something slightly deeper now, an unspoken acknowledgement that both parties were earnestly assessing one another for the lifelong contract that loomed in the distance like a grand estate glimpsed through morning fog. With each encounter, Eleanor found herself both comforted and unsettled by Edward's growing familiarity. He was, without question, a man of refinement. His words never lacked for thoughtful content. His behavior toward her parents remained unfailingly respectful. His attentiveness toward her own preferences suggested genuine regard. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, and occasionally surprised her by recalling small details she had mentioned weeks before, referencing her love for Turner's seascapes or her fondness for rare botanical prints. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Eleanor remained alert for deeper truths concealed by the rules that governed their every interaction. Spring transitioned into early summer with little fanfare, and the city blossomed alongside their courtship. The parks filled with vibrant colors as tulips, crocuses, and daffodils painted the gardens, while London society shook off the lingering chill of winter to embrace its endless social season. Invitations to luncheons, charity teas, and gallery exhibitions flooded the Winthrop household. Eleanor's mother, always vigilant, carefully selected which engagements were most advantageous, ensuring that Eleanor's appearances remained frequent enough to sustain interest, but never so eager as to appear desperate. Every decision reflected the delicate balance between availability and exclusivity, a balance her mother had spent years mastering. It was during one of these excursions, a luncheon hosted by Lady Weatherly, a woman of impeccable breeding and formidable social reach, that Eleanor observed Edward in a new light. The sprawling Weatherly estate in Hampstead provided a lush backdrop for the gathering. Manicured hedgerows framed wide walking paths, while parasols bobbed gently like flower petals among the assembled ladies in pastel silk gowns. The gentlemen stood apart in small groups, conversing in low tones about politics, foreign investments, and the latest parliamentary intrigues. Eleanor walked alongside Edward beneath the shade of tall chestnut trees, her mother trailing behind at a respectful distance with Lady Weatherly herself. As they strolled, Edward spoke with a quiet intensity, describing some of the more complex negotiations he had once conducted while stationed in Tangier. "You see, Miss Winthrop," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "in many ways, diplomacy requires one to say everything without truly revealing anything. One must be transparent in form, but guarded in substance, lest competitors seize upon unintended weaknesses." Eleanor offered a thoughtful nod. "Much like the art of conversation here in London, Mr. Worthington." He chuckled softly. "Indeed, you have captured it perfectly. Our entire society is built upon layers of courtesy masking endless calculations. It is exhausting at times, though necessary." His candor surprised her. It was the first time he had openly acknowledged the performative nature of their world. And yet, it was also this very admission that raised new questions within Eleanor's mind. Was Edward merely resigned to the game? Or had he grown adept at it to the point of becoming entirely detached beneath his charming facade? She studied him carefully, noticing once more the brief flicker of tension in his shoulders whenever sudden movement or loud noises disrupted their surroundings. Even here, beneath the rustling canopy of trees, his eyes darted subtly whenever another guest's laughter rang too sharply or a servant dropped a tray nearby. The signs were small, but undeniable. As the luncheon drew to a close, Lady Weatherly approached Eleanor's mother to offer polite commentary on Eleanor's comportment. "Your daughter possesses an uncommon elegance, Mrs. Winthrop," she remarked with an approving smile. "And intelligence, too. I dare say she carries herself with remarkable restraint for one her age." Mrs. Winthrop inclined her head graciously, her voice warm but cautious. "We have always sought to prepare her for the responsibilities that accompany a proper household. It is heartening to know one's efforts are noticed." "It is not merely noticed, my dear. It is admired," Lady Weatherly continued, casting a sidelong glance toward Edward as he conversed with another gentleman across the lawn. "Mr. Worthington is quite fortunate to have developed such a promising attachment." The words, though complimentary, carried an unmistakable undertone of inquiry, a gentle probe into the status of their evolving courtship. "Mrs. Winthrop responded with the practiced ambiguity that had served her so well over the years. "The young people are becoming well acquainted. Of course, these matters must unfold at a natural pace." The exchange confirmed what Eleanor had long suspected. Word of their relationship had begun circulating within the larger social sphere. There was no retreat from this path now. Their every step would be monitored by eyes both friendly and envious, eager to speculate on the outcome. Later that evening, after returning home and retiring to her room, Eleanor stood before her vanity, staring into her reflection beneath the soft glow of her oil lamp. Margaret carefully unfastened the row of buttons down her back, easing the constrictive gown from her shoulders before helping her into her nightclothes. The familiar rhythm of undressing offered a rare moment of peace, yet Eleanor's thoughts remained far from restful. "Margaret," she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "have you ever wondered whether people's true selves ever reveal themselves fully, even in marriage?" The maid paused, her hands briefly stilling as she folded the discarded gown. She looked at Eleanor's reflection in the mirror, her expression thoughtful but cautious. "I imagine, miss, that everyone hides parts of themselves. Some do it for protection, others out of habit. But time has a way of bringing truth forward, even when folks try to keep it locked away. Eleanor nodded, offering a faint smile tinged with sadness. And what if one marries before those truths emerge? Margaret offered a small shrug, her tone gentle. Then one must learn to face what comes, miss. Marriage is not always about knowing everything beforehand, but about having the strength to endure what is revealed. The simplicity of Margaret's words struck Eleanor deeply. Beneath all the lace, ceremony, and social pageantry, marriage remained what it always had been, an unpredictable merging of lives, often undertaken with imperfect knowledge. No amount of careful courtship could guarantee compatibility, nor shield one from discovering painful secrets once the vows were exchanged. That night, long after the house had grown silent, Eleanor lay awake beneath the canopy of her bed, listening to the soft creak of wood and the occasional patter of rain against her window. In her mind's eye, she replayed Edward's subtle reactions, his flashes of vulnerability hidden beneath polished manners. She felt both drawn and wary, captivated by his charm, yet haunted by questions no proper young woman could safely ask aloud. The path before her continued to narrow, but she resolved that whatever decision awaited her, she would not walk blindly into it. She would watch and wait and listen. As June unfolded and London basked under an unusually forgiving sun, the pace of Eleanor and Edward's courtship accelerated, as though propelled by unseen hands eager to seal their union before the summer fully arrived. With each visit, Edward appeared increasingly at ease, his manner smooth and confident, his conversation engaging, always tailored to reflect the topics Eleanor had previously expressed interest in. Their walks through Hyde Park became lengthier, the conversations richer, while chaperones lingered at respectful distances, allowing just enough privacy for true familiarity to cautiously blossom beneath their watchful gazes. Eleanor found herself enjoying his company, even drawn to his worldliness and thoughtful observations, but always in the quiet recesses of her mind, she guarded her instincts, carefully observing the subtleties of his behavior that no charming story or polished compliment could fully conceal. One particular afternoon stood apart from the others, marking the first moment where the cracks beneath Edward's composed exterior threatened to reveal themselves more fully. The Worthington family had extended an invitation for the Winthrops to join them for a private luncheon at their countryside estate in Surrey, a sprawling property framed by rolling green hills, stately elms, and manicured rose gardens that perfumed the warm summer air. The visit was an unmistakable signal of growing seriousness. An invitation of this nature was extended only when marriage was no longer merely speculative, but actively approaching. Their carriage ride to Surrey was long and serene, the countryside unfolding in waves of green pastures and dotted cottages. Eleanor sat beside her mother, who wore an expression of serene determination, her gloved hands resting calmly in her lap, as the rhythmic clatter of wheels filled the space between their sparse conversation. Across from them, Mr. Winthrop reviewed several business documents as though seeking distraction from the significance of the day. Eleanor stared out the carriage window, her mind swirling with anticipation and curiosity. Today, more than ever, she would watch Edward closely. Upon arrival, the Worthington estate revealed itself in full grandeur. A wide gravel drive led to the imposing stone manor, ivy climbing along its sunlit walls while uniformed footmen stood ready at the entrance. Edward greeted them at the door, his manner impeccable as always, bowing slightly before offering his hand to assist Eleanor from the carriage. His grip was firm yet gentle, his smile warm but not overly familiar, a perfect balance of affection and restraint. "Miss Winthrop," he greeted softly, "it is a delight to see you here. I trust your journey was pleasant?" "Very much so, Mr. Worthington," Eleanor replied with equal poise, allowing her eyes to meet his for a brief, deliberate moment. "Your estate is quite beautiful." "Thank you," Edward said, gesturing toward the entryway. "Shall we?" The luncheon was served in a grand dining room whose towering windows bathed the table in golden light. The Worthingtons spared no detail. Silver gleamed, Crystal glasses sparkled, and the meal unfolded in a succession of perfectly timed courses prepared by skilled hands. The conversation drifted through pleasant territories: recent art exhibitions, the Queen's upcoming public appearance, and Mr. Winthrop's growing concerns over the influx of mass-produced books threatening his craft. Edward navigated these topics gracefully, always offering insights that impressed both Eleanor's parents and their hosts. But it was after the meal, as they moved to the gardens for a leisurely walk, that Eleanor witnessed something altogether different. The rose garden behind the manor stretched in neat rows of color, their blooms swaying gently beneath a light breeze. Bees hummed lazily among the petals, while songbirds chirped from nearby branches. Eleanor and Edward strolled slightly ahead of the others, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. It was here, removed from the formality of the dining table, that Edward's mask momentarily faltered. As they walked, a loud crack suddenly rang out from beyond the hedgerow. A gardener's misfired tool, perhaps, or a snapping branch under unexpected weight. The sharp sound startled several birds into flight and drew a quiet gasp from Eleanor. But Edward's reaction was far more pronounced. His shoulders jerked violently, his breath caught audibly, and for a split second, his entire body tensed as though bracing for an unseen threat. His eyes darted instinctively toward the noise's source. His jaw clenched tight, and his right hand twitched ever so slightly, fingers curling as if reaching for something absent. It was over in seconds, but Eleanor saw everything. When Edward realized nothing dangerous followed, he forced a thin, apologetic smile and exhaled sharply, as though pushing the tension out of his chest. "Ah, forgive me," he said with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I confess the countryside's occasional surprises still catch me off guard after too many years abroad." Eleanor recovered quickly, matching his smile with one of quiet reassurance. "Understandable, Mr. Worthington. New surroundings often require adjustments." Yet inside, Eleanor's mind raced. This was no ordinary startle. She had witnessed this pattern before: the brief stiffening, the defensive glance, the suppressed tremor beneath his otherwise composed exterior. It was a reaction born not of delicate nerves, but of someone conditioned by experience to expect danger. Though unsaid, the question hung heavy in Eleanor's mind. What had Edward encountered during his time abroad that left such residue in his manner? As they continued their walk, Edward deftly steered the conversation back into lighter territory, discussing the recent shipment of silk textiles from India and his hopes to one day open a private trading house independent from his consortium employers. Eleanor listened attentively, offering encouragement where appropriate, but her gaze lingered longer than usual on the set of his shoulders, the tightness of his grip upon his walking stick, and the faint crease that appeared between his brows whenever distant noises echoed faintly through the rolling hills. By the time they returned to the manor for tea, Edward's composure had fully returned. The remainder of the afternoon proceeded with pleasant familiarity, and both families exchanged farewells with the warmth of growing confidence that the match between their children would soon yield formal engagement. As their carriage departed the Worthington estate, Mrs. Winthrop smiled approvingly at her daughter. "He will propose soon, I believe," she remarked softly. "It has all progressed exactly as we hoped." Eleanor offered a polite smile in return, but her thoughts remained tangled. She could not ignore what she had seen, not the occasional glimmer of discomfort, nor the haunting shadow that flickered behind Edward's eyes. What weight did he carry? And would it one day fall upon her as well, should they marry? That night, as Margaret loosened her corset and carefully folded her gown away, Eleanor sat in quiet contemplation. The moonlight streamed softly through the lace curtains, casting silver shadows across her chamber. Her instincts whispered warnings, faint but persistent, and she resolved that if Edward's past contained hidden struggles, she would not remain blind to them. Love, she knew, could not thrive on charm alone. It demanded truth, however uncomfortable. As July settled over London, the city seemed to shimmer beneath a dome of warmth that softened the harsh angles of stone buildings and turned the Thames into a silver ribbon beneath the sun's unwavering gaze. The Winthrop household, too, grew warm under this rare English heat, though its internal temperature was fueled not only by the weather, but by rising expectations. Whispers circulated freely now among friends and acquaintances that Edward Worthington's intentions were all but certain. Invitations to various gatherings multiplied, each one carefully orchestrated to further display Eleanor's refinement and compatibility. Mrs. Winthrop managed these social appearances with unwavering precision, ensuring that every public encounter between Eleanor and Edward reinforced their image as a pair destined for engagement. Despite the smooth progression of events, Eleanor's unease grew in equal measure. The charm, the courtesy, the calculated attentiveness, all continued flawlessly, but so did Edward's subtle moments of tension. Each startled flinch, each brief tightening of his expression when loud sounds intruded, layered upon Eleanor's quiet suspicions. She had observed these glimpses enough now to know they were not isolated moments, but rather symptoms of something far deeper, something embedded within Edward's past that he had not yet chosen to reveal. And though her position offered her no appropriate way to inquire directly, her curiosity gnawed at her with increasing insistence. One Thursday afternoon, as part of their now regular outings, Edward invited Eleanor and her parents to accompany him on a private tour of the British Museum, a gesture that combined intellectual sophistication with the growing intimacy of their courtship. The vast halls of marble filled with ancient relics, towering statues, and glass cases housing fragile artifacts provided a cool respite from the oppressive summer heat. Their group wandered slowly through the exhibits, discussing Mesopotamian tablets, Egyptian funerary masks, and Roman mosaics, as though the distant echoes of history might somehow mirror their own unfolding drama. It was during their examination of an intricate collection of North African maps that Edward's carefully constructed veneer finally began to thin. As he traced his gloved fingertip across a detailed depiction of Tangiers' coastal contours, his voice grew distant, almost hollow. The port city lies between worlds, Miss Winthrop. East and west converge there, but not without conflict. His eyes, usually so sharply attentive, seemed momentarily far away. One learns quickly to navigate shifting loyalties, hidden dangers. Trade, after all, is never as simple as exchanging goods. Eleanor studied his profile, watching the faint shadow that crossed his features. She spoke softly, choosing her words with care. It must have been challenging work. Not all danger reveals itself at first glance. Edward's lips twitched into a small humorless smile. Indeed. Appearances deceive often, Miss Winthrop. Sometimes what looks like an opportunity conceals a snare. His voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. One does not serve abroad for 5 years without learning hard lessons. Mrs. Winthrop, trailing behind them with Mr. Worthington in quiet conversation, remained just far enough away that Edward's words reached only Eleanor. The significance of his confession was not lost on her. This was as close as propriety allowed him to venture into his personal burdens, and Eleanor sensed the deliberate nature of his admission. "Then you have returned stronger for having endured them," she offered gently, providing him an opportunity to retreat should he wish. "It speaks well of your character." He glanced sideways at her, his brown eyes briefly revealing something raw, an emotion carefully locked away for much of their courtship. "Perhaps," he replied softly. "Or perhaps some wounds remain unseen." Their eyes met for a moment, longer than custom allowed, and Eleanor's breath caught slightly at the vulnerability she glimpsed. But as quickly as it appeared, Edward's guard reasserted itself. He turned, gesturing toward a nearby exhibit of Moroccan textiles, resuming their tour with smooth authority. The afternoon concluded without further revelations, but Eleanor carried Edward's words heavily in her thoughts. That evening, after returning home and enduring her mother's enthusiastic analysis of the museum visit, Eleanor withdrew to her room. The moonlight bathed her in silver as she sat before her vanity, her mind restless. She stared at her reflection, seeing not merely the painted image of the flawless young woman society required, but the flickering doubts that now danced behind her own eyes. Margaret entered quietly, setting a silver tray beside her mistress containing a small pot of chamomile tea and a plate of simple biscuits. Sensing Eleanor's unrest, she spoke softly. "You're troubled, miss." Eleanor's voice emerged barely above a whisper. "I believe Mr. Worthington carries burdens that he has not yet shared." Margaret nodded with quiet understanding as she poured the tea, her hands steady. "Many men return from foreign lands with shadows following them, miss. Some speak of it, others carry it in silence. It does not mean they lack kindness, but it may mean they have known things no one should witness." Eleanor sipped her tea, savoring its warmth while pondering Margaret's words. "But what if those shadows remain? What if they shape his future, our future?" Margaret placed a comforting hand briefly upon Eleanor's shoulder. "Then you must weigh whether you are willing to share those shadows with him. Marriage binds lives together, miss. You do not only take the man, you take what he carries." The following days passed quickly, each visit from Edward wrapped once more in polished civility and pleasant discourse. Yet behind his charming stories and engaging debates, Eleanor sensed a subtle shift. Perhaps emboldened by his earlier confession, Edward seemed less guarded, though no further disclosures came. His eyes lingered longer upon her, his conversation occasionally drifting into reflections on personal resilience, on the cost of ambition, and the burden of responsibility. These moments offered only glimpses, but they revealed enough for Eleanor to confirm what she had long suspected. Edward's charm was genuine, but it was also a practiced shield, one born not merely of societal training, but of necessity. And then, as August's warmth deepened, the long-anticipated proposal arrived. It was a Sunday afternoon, their regular time together, and the Winthrop drawing room glowed beneath the filtered sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Mrs. Winthrop had, as always, arranged the setting with perfection. A fresh bouquet of lilies graced the mantel, delicate china gleamed from its display cabinet, and Cook's finest almond tarts sat waiting upon the polished tea service. Mr. Winthrop sat quietly near the fireplace, his newspaper folded neatly upon his lap, while Eleanor's mother busied herself with embroidery, though her stitches slowed noticeably as Edward entered the room. He greeted the family with familiar grace before turning his full attention to Eleanor. His expression was warm, yet his eyes carried a deeper resolve than before. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Edward requested a private word with Mr. Winthrop, a formality observed to demonstrate proper respect before any proposal was made. The two men stepped into Mr. Winthrop's study, leaving Eleanor and her mother waiting in silence. The clock ticked loudly in the stillness, each second drawing out Eleanor's heartbeat until it thrummed in her ears. When they returned, both men bore matching expressions of approval, though Mr. Winthrop's eyes held a gravity that signaled the seriousness of what had transpired. Edward approached Eleanor, his voice steady yet tender. "Miss Winthrop, with your father's blessing, I would be deeply honored if you would accept my proposal of marriage." The words hung suspended, charged with all the weight of expectation. Eleanor's breath quickened. The path laid before her for months had reached its inevitable moment. She looked into Edward's eyes, searching for sincerity beneath the polished exterior, for truth beneath the careful courtship. And in that moment she saw both his hope and his fear. With a poised breath, Eleanor offered a gentle, deliberate smile. "Yes, Mr. Worthington, I would be honored." The room exhaled as one, the formal engagement now sealed beneath the unyielding gaze of Victorian decorum. And yet, in Eleanor's heart, alongside hope, bloomed caution, a quiet awareness that their journey had only just begun. The weeks following Eleanor's acceptance unfolded beneath a veil of carefully controlled excitement, where joy mingled with scrutiny and every movement became a public performance. London society, ever hungry for fresh engagements to dissect, embraced the announcement with a predictable flurry of gossip, congratulations, and whispered speculation. Mrs. Winthrop, ever the skilled navigator of these waters, handled the growing attention with precision, attending luncheons and teas where acquaintances offered their effusive praise and subtle inquiries into Edward's background and prospects. Eleanor accompanied her mother to these gatherings, her every word and gesture weighed with the same care as a diplomat presenting a treaty. She wore her new status like a silk glove, smooth on the surface, but concealing the steady pulse of her thoughts beneath. The Worthingtons, too, played their part to perfection. Edward's mother, Mrs. Henrietta Worthington, made her rounds among the city's most respectable circles, ensuring that no stain or question marred her son's match. She spoke warmly of Eleanor's refinement, praised the Winthrops' steady, respectable business, and hinted at the impressive future her son was building through his mercantile ambitions. In truth, the engagement was a perfect merger of two families who, while not of aristocratic blood, held firm places within the city's prosperous middle class. A union of stability, propriety, and growing financial security. As was customary, the period of engagement brought increased intimacy, though still under the vigilant gaze of propriety. Eleanor and Edward's meetings grew slightly longer, their walks in Hyde Park slightly less chaperoned, though a respectable distance was always maintained by an attendant or family member positioned nearby. Their conversations deepened further, allowing Eleanor to peer more fully into Edward's ambitions and the mind that fueled them. He spoke often of his future business plans, detailing the network of shipping routes and trading houses he hoped to one day command. His passion for enterprise burned brightly, though it carried with it a certain restlessness, as though no success could fully quiet the hunger that drove him forward. One afternoon, as they walked slowly beneath the towering elms lining the park's northern edge, Edward's voice softened, revealing a rare candidness. "I must confess, Eleanor, that my time abroad taught me as much about survival as it did about trade. The markets of Tangier are not like the counting houses of London. There one's fortunes shift with the wind, and alliances are forged as much with discretion as with contracts." Eleanor glanced at him, sensing once more the darker undercurrent that occasionally slipped into his words. "And you managed those challenges well, it seems. You returned not only with experience, but with a vision." Edward offered a faint, distant smile. "Yes, though it was not without cost." He paused briefly, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead, as though weighing how much more to reveal. "One encounters men who will do unspeakable things for profit, Miss Winthrop, men whose greed knows no boundaries. I witnessed betrayals, violence, moments that remain with me still." The admission hung in the air like an unwelcome mist, chilling despite the summer warmth. Eleanor responded carefully, her voice soft but steady. "Such experiences leave marks, I imagine. Some visible, others less so." His eyes flickered to meet hers, gratitude mingling with something unspoken. "Indeed. You see more than most." Their conversation shifted soon after to safer ground, discussions of estate plans, potential properties, and the upcoming engagement dinner their families were preparing. But Eleanor carried his words with her, adding them to the quiet ledger she kept in her mind, a record of hints, glimpses, and half-revealed truths that painted a far more complicated portrait than the one presented at social gatherings. The engagement dinner, scheduled 2 weeks later, marked another major milestone. Held at the Worthington estate in Surrey, it was attended by family friends, business partners, and a select circle of society figures eager to observe the match firsthand. The dining hall gleamed under the glow of crystal chandeliers, silverware polished to mirror-like shine, and the rich scent of roasted game and fresh herbs wafted through the air. Eleanor sat beside Edward at the long mahogany table, the two of them framed by their respective parents who conversed amiably with their distinguished guests. Throughout the evening, Edward remained the perfect host, charming, attentive, and articulate, navigating conversations with seasoned grace. He praised Eleanor's interests, spoke of their shared vision for the future, and deftly parried the inquiries of those who probed too closely into his foreign dealings. Eleanor played her role with equal finesse, offering thoughtful contributions and maintaining the composed warmth expected of a woman soon to bear a new family name. Yet beneath her outward serenity, her mind remained sharp, dissecting each exchange with growing clarity. As dessert was served, a delicate raspberry tort accompanied by fine French brandy, an older gentleman seated across from Edward posed a question that momentarily unsettled the carefully polished atmosphere. "Tell me, Mr. Worthington," he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "during your years abroad, did you ever find yourself entangled in unpleasant local disputes? One hears unsettling stories from those regions, particularly regarding the trade routes passing through Spanish territories. The table quieted subtly, though no one openly acknowledged the tension the question introduced. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers momentarily gripping his brandy glass with increased pressure before he composed himself. "I found," Edward replied smoothly, "that discretion and respect for local customs served me well, sir. Conflicts existed, of course, but I took care to avoid becoming a participant. Business at its core is best conducted without unnecessary entanglements." The older gentleman nodded, satisfied enough to release the subject, but Eleanor's sharp eyes caught the flicker of something raw behind Edward's composed answer. An echo of restraint, of truths too dangerous or shameful to share within the safety of the dining hall's gilded walls. Later that evening, after the final farewells were offered, and the guests departed beneath the moonlit drive, Edward and Eleanor stood briefly alone in the garden, separated from the bustling household, as the servants cleared the remnants of the grand meal. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses and damp earth. A lantern glowed softly beside them, casting golden halos around their faces. "Eleanor," Edward said quietly, breaking the gentle silence, "I know I have not spoken of my past in great detail. There are matters I have withheld." She turned toward him, her face calm but watchful. "I have sensed as much." He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling night. "There are things I have seen, done, or narrowly escaped that I would not wish to burden you with, but I fear they live within me still, shaping the man I am." Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her heart beat faster beneath her corset's embrace. "And do you fear they will shape our life together?" Edward hesitated, his eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "I pray not, but I would be dishonest to pretend they do not linger." For a long moment neither spoke, the weight of honesty suspended between them like an unsteady bridge. At last, Eleanor reached for his gloved hand, resting hers lightly upon it. "We all carry burdens, Edward," she whispered. "It is how we bear them that matters." His shoulders relaxed slightly, his eyes filled with an emotion Eleanor could not fully decipher. Was it relief? Gratitude? Or was it simply the momentary comfort of having released a fraction of the weight he bore? She could not yet tell, but for now it was enough. The engagement period continued as planned, but for Eleanor, the shadows had sharpened. She was walking toward marriage with eyes wide open, prepared to meet not only Edward's charm but also the secrets lurking quietly behind his polished facade. As August ripened into its final heavy weeks, the wedding day approached like a grand ship slowly emerging from the mist, inevitable and immense. Invitations had been sent, garments fitted, and the intricate arrangements that accompanied any respectable ceremony were executed with tireless precision. Mrs. Winthrop, who had been orchestrating every detail for months, now moved through the house like a conductor guiding the final crescendos of an elaborate symphony. Seamstresses came and went with armfuls of ivory satin and delicate lace. Jewelers delivered modest but elegant pieces for the ceremony. Florists carefully measured the drawing rooms, noting how best to drape cascades of white roses and lilies. Eleanor's gown was nearing completion, an exquisite creation of silk, embroidered with fine pearls along the bodice, its long train destined to glide gracefully behind her as she walked toward her future. The city, too, seemed to hum with anticipation, though whether that hum was one of celebration or watchful curiosity was less clear. Word of Eleanor and Edward's impending marriage had spread throughout the Winthrop social circles, drawing both admiration and envious whispers. Many praised the union, a joining of two families whose rising fortunes promised future stability and prominence. But a few sharp-tongued voices questioned the haste of the engagement, hinting at secrets better left unspoken. Eleanor, hearing these whispers only through indirect channels, carried them silently, adding their weight to the calculations she had long been conducting in the privacy of her own mind. Edward remained his composed self throughout, appearing both delighted and perfectly attentive in each of their meetings. His letters arrived promptly, each one filled with elegant prose and gentle declarations of affection, as though carefully designed to comfort any lingering reservations Eleanor might harbor. And yet, even as she read his beautifully penned words, she could not fully quiet the small voice that still whispered caution. His confessions in the garden, though sincere, had offered no specific explanations, only abstract acknowledgments of burdens carried from his years abroad. She had accepted his honesty in that moment, but it had left doors unsealed, allowing her imagination to fill in the unanswered spaces. 2 weeks before the wedding, as tradition dictated, the Winthrops hosted a formal engagement ball at their London townhouse. The event was their grandest display yet, a statement of their family's standing and of Eleanor's carefully cultivated readiness for the station she was about to assume. The house glittered beneath countless candle-lit chandeliers, casting warm golden reflections against polished mahogany and crystal. Musicians played softly as elegantly dressed guests arrived, their laughter mingling with the quiet clink of champagne flutes and the rustle of silk gowns sweeping across marble floors. Eleanor descended the staircase as though floating, her gown of pale lavender tulle shimmering with every step. Edward stood waiting for her below, dressed impeccably in a deep navy tailcoat, his polished shoes catching the candlelight. As she approached, he offered his hand, bowing slightly. His smile was gentle, but his eyes, as always, contained layers Eleanor had learned to recognize, warmth mingled with restraint, affection accompanied by calculation. "You look radiant, Eleanor," he whispered as they joined the floor for their first dance. "Thank you," she replied softly, allowing herself to be led into the swirling rhythm of the waltz. Around them, dozens of eyes watched, some with admiration, others with jealousy, and a few with quiet suspicion. But none of that mattered here, within the spinning circle of music and movement where only they existed. As they danced, Edward leaned closer, lowering his voice beneath the melody. "Do you find yourself anxious as the day approaches?" Eleanor met his gaze directly, her tone poised. "Perhaps not anxious, but thoughtful." He nodded as though he understood entirely. "That is wise. Marriage is not a frivolous undertaking. I would be concerned if you approached it with nothing but giddy excitement." The music shifted as the tempo quickened, pulling them into a faster turn. Edward's grip remained firm but never forceful, guiding Eleanor's steps with precision. And yet, she could feel the tension beneath his fingertips, the same subtle tightness that would surface whenever unexpected noises disturbed him. Though he spoke calmly, his body betrayed him still. Between dances, they mingled with guests, receiving congratulations and polite small talk from family friends, business acquaintances, and distant relations. Mrs. Hargrave, whose sharp observations were known well by all in attendance, approached them at one point, her smile warm, but her eyes keen.
"Well, Miss Winthrop," she began, "I do hope you are prepared for the endless flattery and curiosity that will follow you for many months to come. Your match has become quite the subject of conversation." Eleanor smiled graciously. "One grows accustomed to being the subject of conversation, Mrs. Hargrave." The older woman laughed lightly. "Spoken like a woman who already understands far more than she allows others to see. And Mr.
Worthington," she added, turning her gaze to Edward, "I trust you are ready to guard such a rare gem of a bride." Edward inclined his head with perfect politeness. "I consider myself the most fortunate of men, Mrs. Hargrave." Though the exchange was pleasant, Eleanor noted the careful wording of both their responses. The unspoken tension lingered even beneath their most polished performances. Everyone here played their part, but not everyone was fooled by the shine. Later in the evening, as the final guest departed and the candle flames flickered lower, Eleanor stepped briefly into the quiet sanctuary of the library to catch her breath. The heavy scent of leather-bound volumes and beeswax polish surrounded her, offering momentary shelter from the parade of conversations and expectations. She allowed herself to exhale fully, pressing one gloved hand lightly against the carved mahogany shelves for balance. Moments later, Edward entered quietly behind her, closing the door with a muted click. His voice was gentle, almost reverent. "You've carried yourself beautifully tonight." "Thank you," she whispered, not turning to face him immediately. After a pause, he spoke again, his voice carrying a different weight. Eleanor, I know I have asked you to accept certain unknowns about me. I have tried to be as honest as propriety allows. Finally, she turned, meeting his gaze directly, her expression calm but unwavering. And I have accepted what you've chosen to share, but I will not pretend those unknowns do not remain. He stepped closer, his brow furrowing slightly. They are mine to bear. I would not wish to burden you. But if we marry, Edward, your burdens will become mine as well, she replied softly. That is what marriage is. There will be no division between your past and my future. For a long moment, Edward said nothing, his jaw tightening faintly before he spoke again. I can only promise that whatever shadows follow me, I will face them with you, and I will do all within my power to ensure they never fall upon you. Eleanor searched his eyes, seeing the conflict there, the battle between a man who wished to shield her from his private torments and the reality that no wall could fully separate them once vows were exchanged. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Then we must face them together. With that quiet exchange, an invisible thread tightened between them, a solemn understanding that their marriage would not be built solely upon comfort and ease, but upon an acceptance of each other's truths, however incomplete they remained. And as they returned to the drawing room to bid farewell to their remaining guests, Eleanor felt the weight of what lay ahead settle more fully upon her shoulders. Their wedding was now only days away, and with it the life they would build, complex, uncertain, but entirely their own. The morning of the wedding dawned beneath a pale sky, the soft light of September filtering through a thin veil of mist that clung to London's rooftops. The air was cool, almost reverent, as though the entire city recognized the solemnity of what was about to unfold. Inside the Winthrop residence, the household stirred long before first light, each servant moving with the silent precision of soldiers in a well-rehearsed campaign. Margaret and the other maids worked diligently to prepare Eleanor's bridal chamber, laying out every garment, every hairpin, every delicate piece of lace and ribbon that had been chosen for this day. Eleanor stood before her full-length mirror, her breath steady despite the swelling emotions that rippled beneath the surface of her calm expression. Margaret moved around her with deft fingers, fastening the final buttons of the ivory silk gown that shimmered softly beneath the lamplight. The gown's long train spilled behind her like a river of light, embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light as she moved. A lace veil, almost weightless, had been carefully arranged over her intricate chignon, pinned into place with the smallest of combs adorned with mother-of-pearl inlay. You look like a vision, miss, Margaret whispered, her voice warm and proud. No one will ever forget this day. Eleanor offered her a faint smile, reaching briefly for Margaret's hand before releasing it. Thank you. For everything. The preparations continued with quiet efficiency, as Mrs. Winthrop entered the room with moist eyes, her own gown of deep emerald silk rustling gently as she approached her daughter. She did not speak immediately but stood in silent admiration, as though memorizing the image of Eleanor she would carry with her long after this day had passed. My darling, she finally whispered, taking Eleanor's hands in her own. Today you step into the life you were born to build. You have carried yourself with grace far beyond your years, and now you will carry our family name forward into something greater. Eleanor nodded softly, holding her mother's gaze. I will do my best. Soon after, the carriage arrived to escort the Winthrops to St. John's Chapel, where the ceremony was to be held. The streets were lined with curious onlookers, many eager to catch a glimpse of the bride, whose engagement had stirred so much discussion within London's social circles. The chapel itself, a grand stone structure with arched windows and towering spires, stood draped in white roses and lilies, their fragrance mingling with the cool morning air as guests arrived in a steady stream of fine carriages. Inside, Edward stood at the altar, his posture immaculate, his attire flawless. His morning coat of dark charcoal was tailored to perfection, his cravat held by a single pearl pin that gleamed subtly beneath the high collar. Yet even as he greeted the arriving guests with practiced ease, His eyes flickered periodically toward the grand entrance, waiting for Eleanor's arrival. When at last the chapel doors opened and Eleanor stepped forward on her father's arm, a hush fell over the congregation. Gaslight from the tall iron sconces danced along her gown, the veil casting a soft glow over her serene features. Edward's breath seemed to catch for a moment as their eyes met across the expanse of polished marble. A silent exchange passing between them, one that acknowledged not only their affection, but the complexities that had brought them here. The ceremony unfolded with the precise cadence expected of such unions. The vicar's voice rang clear beneath the vaulted ceilings, his words weaving the sacred vows that would bind them before God, family, and society. Eleanor repeated her lines with steady confidence, her voice neither trembling nor forced. Edward's responses, too, carried the same strength of conviction, though to Eleanor's attuned senses, she recognized the slight tremor beneath his composure, a man fully aware of the weight he now committed to share. As the final vows were spoken, and Edward gently lifted the veil to reveal her face beneath, their first kiss as husband and wife was brief, chaste, and observed by countless watchful eyes. Yet in that instant, Eleanor felt a quiet resolve settle within her. She had stepped into this marriage not blind to its shadows, but determined to face them alongside the man who carried them. The reception following the ceremony was a grand affair held at the Worthington estate in Surrey, where the gardens bloomed in late summer splendor. Guests mingled beneath white canopies, sipping champagne, exchanging compliments, and indulging in the elaborate feast prepared for the occasion. Toasts were offered with practiced eloquence, first from Mr. Winthrop, who praised his daughter's grace and Edward's promise, then from Mr. Worthington, who spoke of unity and prosperity. Every speech was met with applause, every anecdote received with polite laughter. As the sun dipped lower and the lanterns began to glow, Eleanor and Edward stole a brief moment of privacy beneath one of the estate's sprawling oak trees, its heavy branches shielding them from view. The laughter and music of the reception faded slightly behind them as they stood together in the quiet evening air. "We are married," Edward whispered, as though tasting the words aloud for the first time. Eleanor nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, and whatever comes, we will face it as one." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. His expression, so often a mask of perfect civility, now carried something deeper, both gratitude and vulnerability. "I never wished to bring my past into this future, Eleanor, but I know I cannot always control what shadows may follow me." "Nor can I," she replied. "But we have made our choice, Edward, and I believe we are stronger for seeing the truth, however incomplete it may be." For a moment neither spoke, the quiet hum of the summer night surrounding them like a soft blanket. Distant laughter from the party filtered through the trees, mingling with the chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves. It was, for Eleanor, a moment of clarity, a recognition that life would not offer simple assurances, but that she had chosen her path with open eyes and a steady heart. The weeks that followed their wedding settled quickly into a rhythm that was both familiar and foreign. Their new home, a grand townhouse gifted partially by the Worthington estate and partially through Edward's growing fortune, became a stage for countless dinners, social visits, and introductions to ever-widening circles of influence. Eleanor adapted quickly, managing their household with grace, overseeing servants, balancing accounts, and entertaining guests with the same poise that had carried her through courtship. Edward, for his part, pursued his business interest with the same calculated energy that had defined him from the start. His trading network expanded, new partnerships were forged, and whispers of his growing influence in foreign markets began circulating once again through London's drawing rooms. Yet privately, Eleanor saw the moments where the old shadows returned, when letters bearing bad news arrived from abroad, when sudden noises made him flinch, when distant memories seemed to momentarily cloud his expression. But true to his word, Edward never hid these moments from her, and Eleanor in turn offered him steady companionship, a quiet refuge where words were not always required. Together they weathered the days of triumph and the nights of unease, building a partnership rooted not only in duty but in mutual understanding. In time, their union grew not only in strength, but in affection. Trust was cultivated with patience, love, with care. And though neither of them spoke often of the burdens Edward had once carried, both understood that their resilience came not from avoiding those shadows, but from learning how to live within them. And now, my dear viewers, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey into Edwardian courtship, thank you. These were not simply love stories, but stories of survival, quiet strength, and navigating a world where every glance, every silence, carried enormous weight. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I would truly love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most? Did this glimpse into history change how you view romance, marriage, or even your own life? Maybe you have family stories passed down from generations who lived through similar customs. Let's keep the conversation going. This community thrives on your voices, your stories, and your reflections. Until next time, take care, and remember, history isn't just dates and names, it's people just like us trying to find their way.